The goal of this teaching is to inform about the campaign here at Vassar, and also to provide information and reasons that support our goal. Some of you may already have been exposed to the campaign. We held events last year. You may have attended it. But at the end of the year, the Board of Trustees and the administration decided not to divest. However, we're still pushing forward with our goal of making our endowment clean of fossil fuels. So we'll begin with presentations from our speakers, with a question and answer time afterwards. Finally, there will be an opportunity to immediately participate in our efforts. I'll read an open letter to the administration, and those of you who are interested can join us in a group photo with the letter. There will also be pizza to be served after the event. So speaking first is Senior Environmental Studies major Noah Bogdonoff, who was one of last year's coordinators for the campaign. And Noah will be speaking about divestment at Vassar. Hi.
Thanks, Graham. So as Graham said, my name is Noah. I co-coordinated the divestment campaign last year. I sort of got involved in divestment by mistake. I stumbled into it because a Green Corps organizer actually came to Vassar to start a coal divestment campaign. And we quickly realized that coal divestment was a very limited, took a very limited scope. And so with the help of the Vassar Greens and my lovely co-coordinator, Gabe Dunsmith, we set forward with a fossil fuel divestment campaign, not really understanding, just how important it was. And over the last 2 years, last year and a half, I realized that divestment is not just about global warming. It's not just about letting ourselves off the hook for being involved in it. It's not even about making an economic impact or a direct economic impact on the fossil fuel industry. It's about being part of a massive symbolic movement and a massive push for pressure on the government to regulate fossil fuels and to desubsidize the fossil fuel industry, which, as I'll talk about, is really an issue of social justice. So if we care about social justice at Vassar, if we're trying to fight bigotry and racism, neocolonialism, all of those things, divestment sits at the nexus of it, and fossil fuel corporations are the reason it's happening. So we have a couple of reasons why we think divestment is super important. The first is that time is running out with respect to global climate change. By 2020, the UN estimates that there will be over 50 million climate refugees. Those are people displaced by the effects of global climate change. And right now, despite all of this, the fossil fuel industry is speculating on 5 times more carbon than can be safely burned. And that's before what they consider cataclysmic environmental disasters beginning to occur. Which is fine if you don't think Hurricane Sandy was cataclysmic enough. Imagine 5 times Hurricane Sandy. So the second reason is that fossil fuels, are running out. The time is ripe for divestment. At some point, we either run out of fossil fuels and those stocks crash, or we regulate the fossil fuel industry to save ourselves, and those stocks crash. So divestment is financially smart in the long run. Maybe the college thinks it can milk a few more years out of these investments, but we argue that there's a better way to make money. And I guess Professor Ruud will talk a little bit more about that. And the third one I think is maybe the most important, which is that divestment is an issue of environmental racism, exploitation, and trash imperialism, which, if anyone is in a class with Pinar before, maybe you've heard about this. But just some statistics to throw out. In the United States, if you're black, there's a 65% chance that you're breathing air with at least 2 toxins at unsafe rates. So the air that has extremely, toxic chemicals at rates considered unsafe by the EPA. If you're Latino, that goes up to 80%. Black and Latino citizens are 60% more likely to live close to toxic waste sites than white citizens. And if you're Native American, that goes up to 80%. And this isn't just coincidence. Fossil fuel corporations put refineries and extraction sites in poor communities and communities of color because they know it's more socially acceptable to do that than it is to poison white affluent communities. This is a problem, and it's one that we can be helpful in changing. Because the people who are exploited by the fossil fuel industries are also the most socially oppressed, they have very little freedom to protest publicly. Families who work in refineries and in mining towns can't speak out without fear of losing their jobs because the companies control their towns, often with the support of the FBI and the local police. On a personal note, I was at a conference about divestment at Swarthmore, and I met a couple of people from these towns, and they can't go like 4 days without getting nosebleeds. Children are born with cancer. So this is a real issue. And the government is supporting it and protecting the companies that are doing it. So that's what divestment is about for me. And then there's also, the intersecting issue of immigration reform, because a lot of the people in these towns, the towns most exploited by fossil fuel industries, know or are undocumented workers. That means they can't protest against their working conditions, and they can't protest against the environmental conditions in their town without fearing deportation, which is horrible. So you can't protect yourself, or at least you can't publicly protect yourself, because you are going to be sent away if you do so. In Pennsylvania, a fracking company polluted a family's drinking water, so they couldn't drink without being exposed to incredibly toxic substances. If you watch the movie Gasland, you can actually see that in some fracking towns, you can light the water that comes out of your faucet on fire. So this family settled out of court with the company. They provided money to pay for the children's education, as well as a steady supply of bottled water. If nobody in the family spoke about fracking or the Marcellus Shale ever again in their lives. Their son was 10 years old, so he's not allowed to talk about something that could potentially give him cancer later in life, ever, without facing legal repercussions. And, the court approved this. So, knowing all of that, I'm going to move to the international scale, because a lot of this is happening in less developed countries, or developing countries. In 1991, the chief economist of the World Bank, Larry Summers, released a memo arguing that dirty industries should be exported to developing countries because it's cheaper to pollute those countries due to lower levels of regulation, and that countries with the lowest wages will accept the most dangerous and exploitative industries, and the fact that developed countries demand higher health standards. His argument is essentially, they need jobs, they're already dying earlier than we are, and we care more about health than they do. Does anybody see a problem with that? So what does that have to do with Vassar? Last year we did a lot of outreach. We worked very hard to get to the College Investor Responsibility Committee and the Trustee Investor Responsibility Committee. The College Investor Responsibility Committee exists to ensure that Vassar's endowment is a socially responsible. It exists to make sure that we're not being exploitative and oppressive with the money that we invest. Mostly this happens with, proxy votes. This happens, a proxy vote is so we hold shares in a company. And every once in a while, someone will write a proposal and send it out to all of the shareholders. And all of the shareholders can vote yes or no on this proposal. So the proposal, to ExxonMobil could be stop extracting fossil fuels. and all of the shareholders except for me would vote no, because that would destroy all the profits. This happens frequently. Shareholder proxies don't go through, but I'll talk about that a little bit at a later point. Anyway, so when we ended up getting into into talk to the trustees, well, the College Investor Responsibility Committee, and when the College Investor Responsibility Committee communicated with the Trustee Investor Responsibility Committee, so maybe you're getting a sense of all of the bureaucracy involved in this. We were told that, the endowment exists just to make money for Vassar. It's not political. Hopefully, over the last couple of minutes, you've come to see that this is a political issue. There's no such thing as an apolitical investment. When we give money to something, we are either actively or passively accepting what they stand for. But we were told when we got into discussions with individual members of the Office of Finance and Administration that because the fossil fuel industries provide jobs to some people, it's okay to pollute their environments. It's okay to keep doing that. So that is the sort of jingoistic and bigoted policy that allows oppression to exist on a widespread scale. When we say, it's okay to exploit them because they're getting a job, a single job that exposes them to massive amounts of toxins, instead of a clean job that they feel good going to, which is possible. That's not, in my mind, good rhetoric. But it's what we were told. So I come back to my first point, which is if you believe that we should be fighting bigotry, racism, sexism at Vassar, then you have to understand that these attitudes, the things we're trying to fight, and the ideologies we're trying to fight, come from the top. The highest levels of administration in the government and at Vassar are playing into a neo-colonial and racist rhetoric. So the last reason, Divest, is that this may be the most powerful any of us in this room ever get, because we're part of an institution. We're part of a large, fairly influential, pretty rich institution that has a voice. If I jumped up and down and said, boo fossil fuels alone, I would have no power. Vassar's got a pretty big voice. Middlebury's got a pretty big voice. Haverford's got a pretty big voice. Swarthmore's got a pretty big voice. The city of Seattle and San Francisco all have pretty big voices. When a lot of divestment campaigns join together, we start to have a voice, and that voice can disentangle the fossil fuel industry from the government, provide real change in the way the fossil fuel industry is regulated, and in the subsidy structure of our energy system. So I think that is really important to keep in mind. If you want to make a change, this is the time and this is the place to do it. Okay, so I don't know how long I did, but 10 to 12 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about arguments that have been lodged against us, and then I'll let Casey and Professor Rashid go on with their talks. So why not divest? The first argument is that we will not make an economic impact. Hopefully, in my last point, you've come to understand we know that. We're not going to suddenly divest $12 million from ExxonMobil and cripple them. I don't even want to know how much money they have. That's not the point. The point is that it's symbolic. The point is that we have a voice as an institution. The second argument is that it's totally not economically feasible and it's going to cost us tons of money. And I'm going to let Professor Ruud talk about that. The third is that it doesn't have any effect, that we'll just be jumping up and down, like I said. I also think this is wrong, mainly because we have a model for this. In the late 1980s, colleges and faith groups and pension plans and cities divested from apartheid South Africa, and it worked. And Desmond Tutu, who was a leading figure in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, has said that the student divestment movement was one of the largest factors in toppling apartheid, at least from the outside. So it can work. And then, of course, once you say that, the argument that we got from the head of the Trustee Investor Responsibility Committee, Christiana Wood, is that, well, that didn't actually work because the companies, who were being exploitative in South Africa, once apartheid ended, just continued to be exploited. And that might be true, but fossil fuel divestment is not apartheid divestment. In South Africa, the divestment campaigns were a protest against a policy. We're protesting a lack of policy. There are so few regulations on fossil fuels and so many fossil fuel subsidies that these companies are allowed to be exploitative, destructive, and racist without any repercussion, which is very different from the situation in apartheid-era South Africa, where racism was explicitly condoned and mandated in some cases. Removing institutionalized racism is an important step, but there's some validity in saying that it doesn't provide protection against further exploitation. With fossil fuel divestment, we're pushing the government to disentangle itself from the fossil fuel industry, to make policy based on people rather than corporate profits, and to actually regulate the extraction and refinement of fossil fuels, so they don't continue to poison those who are already the most oppressed in the most oppressed social and economic strata. So I'm going to talk a little bit about proxy votes because people love to tell us that we should not divest but instead use our shareholder power. First of all, most of our investments in fossil fuels are in commingled funds. We don't even have proxy votes. Secondly, can you proxy vote a fossil fuel company into not extracting fossil fuels? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And the argument is then, well, what if we could get them to stop being environmentally racist? What if we could push through a proxy vote telling them to not do something? All that would do is ask them to self-regulate. Do we really trust, BP to self-regulate? I mean, look at the Gulf Coast oil spill. They were found, the companies involved in that were found guilty of gross negligence. And also, it's kind of a farce to think that the government can regulate it with the current structure, because the EPA only has 56 inspectors, and a budget of $8 million for its entire environmental justice investigation program. Each year, the government gives up to $52 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. I'm sorry, that's kind of fucked up. So the last thing, second to last thing is that if we divest, we will destroy all of the towns that rely on fossil fuels for jobs. Well, most of those towns already face unemployment rates of up to 80%. The damage has already been done because you can't farm. There is no other answer. You either graduate from college or graduate from high school and go to college, you go into the army, or you work for a fossil fuel company. We're not advocating, the fossil fuel divestment campaign is not advocating shutting down the fossil fuel industry like that. What we're advocating is a transition, one that would allow these communities to transition to something more sustainable and better for their citizens. So the last thing is that the divestment movement is dead. It's not. But if you look at the media, you might not know that because we were recently featured in the New York Times saying that divestment as a movement was on its last legs. This is actually really great for us because when we win, it's going to be a real surprise. They've pinned us as the underdogs, and they've told us that there's no way we can do this. I think it's time for us to come out swinging. I think it's time for us to have our Rocky moment. So, we might not look like Sylvester Stallone, but we as students can pack that. So, thanks. All right, thanks, Noah. So, next we have
350.org, which is the organization that actually began the divestment movement. And Casey will be speaking about the national divestment movement as a whole.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be with you all as part of also a national week of action that's happening right now as the semester comes to a close with students that have received no's over the last couple of months from their administrators. We're all taking action and saying that these rejections are denied and that they're not giving up because this crisis, this climate crisis that we're up against is too important to ignore. I work with campuses all over the tri-state area, so working with schools like Cornell and Wesleyan, Yale, other schools that have been doing fantastic organizing over the last several months and a couple of years now. And I'm incredibly inspired by all of the amazing work that you all have done over the last year and a half at Vassar, and how much you've accomplished. From gaining hundreds of petition signatures, from having large rally outside the Board of Trustees meeting last semester, presenting to the board. You all have made some incredible progress, which a lot of students at other campuses across the country are really looking to and taking inspiration from. I first got involved with working with 350 after having done student organizing when I was student at Cornell. I did a lot of work with the Cornell Sustainability Office and worked to try to help educate students to try and make personal behavior changes to help make our campus more sustainable. And I did that for a while. And I think it's really important that we, as individuals, reduce our waste as much as possible and have reusable water bottles and to turn off the lights and everything that we, as individuals, have the capacity to do. But it's not enough. When I learned about fracking that was threatening upstate New York, living in the Finger Lakes region of New York, I got frustrated and learned that the challenges that we're up against with the fossil fuel industry are not going to be solved by individuals alone. That we need to come together as communities and as collective institutions to build our power and to take on this fossil fuel industry that is threatening our futures and communities already that are being impacted by the fossil fuel industry and climate change. So that's a little bit about how I got involved. And from there, jumped into the fossil fuel divestment movement and learned about the power of organizing and being part of social movements to really shift the balance of forces and shift the status quo to have transformative action. So why divestment and why are we working on climate change? I'll just talk a little bit about the map of climate change. I'm sure a lot of you are already aware that this is a real and urgent threat. In the last couple of months, we've had new studies come out that show just how drastically we need climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency have recently released studies that say that any warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius could have catastrophic effects for civilization as we know it. And we can emit roughly another 500 gigatons of carbon before we hit that point. But the fossil fuel industry already has over 5 times that amount of carbon in its reserves that it's ready to burn. And then just recently, James Hansen, former NASA climatologist and professor and researcher at Columbia, recently said that even just a 2 degrees Celsius rise in global warming would have disastrous consequences. We need to probably half that carbon budget. So we also know that the fossil fuel industry is continually looking for more and more sources of carbon. ExxonMobil alone spends $100 million a day searching for new sources of coal, oil, and gas, and more extreme forms of energy, from fracking to mountain removal, coal mining to deep water drilling. And we also know that the fossil fuel industry has impacts, like Noah mentioned, that are happening for communities now. Climate change isn't just some far-off threat that will maybe our grandchildren will have to worry about. But from extreme storms and weather that we've seen Last year, that threatened the East Coast with Hurricane Sandy caused $68 billion worth of damage, and communities are still struggling to recover from that. Or even just the most recent devastation caused in the Philippines from Typhoon Haiyan, with over 5,700 deaths reported and thousands more missing. So we know that communities are being impacted now by climate change and will only continue to get worse. And that fossil fuel extraction and burning devastates communities and exacerbates existing inequalities based on race and class. Whether it's fracking in Pennsylvania, or mountaintop removal coal mining in West Virginia, or pipelines in the Keystone XL pipeline that's being built in southern Texas. So, with all of that, we know that the fossil fuel industry is a rogue industry, that its entire business model is opposed to our survival. It's set to burn 5 times more carbon than the world's leading scientists have said is safe. So that's why we know that shareholder engagement won't work with the fossil fuel industry. We can't tell them to just stop burning their reserves and to stop making a profit. So that's why, in addition, we also know that the fossil fuel industry is spending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars each year funding climate denial think tanks like the Heartland Institute or the American Petroleum Institute, and blocking any potential climate legislation. So we have some good news too. We also know that a recent study came out from Stanford and Cornell researchers called the 2030 Plan that outlines the potential for 100% clean energy in New York State by 2030, which is incredible because it focuses on existing technology with wind, water, and solar. So that's not even accounting for innovations and continual improvements in clean energy technology development. So this shows that we're not lacking the technology to take action on climate change, but we're lacking the political will. So that's where divestment comes in. So fossil fuel divestment, what are we asking for? With the national movement, it was actually originally started with Swarthmore College calling for divestment from some of the dirtiest mountaintop removal coal mining companies. We're asking for an immediate freeze on new investments in the top 200 companies with the largest reserves of coal, oil, and gas, and then for a complete phase out over 5 years. And that's not just manageable or doable, it's the right thing to do. As Bill McKibben, who's the president of 350, has said, if it's wrong to wreck the planet, then it's wrong to profit from that wreckage. So that's why we're calling on universities and other large institutions to take their investments out of these immoral companies. Because these companies that are blocking climate legislation, it's immoral for our educational institutions to be affiliated with these companies. And it's time for us to invest in ways that are aligned with our mission and help society actually address the climate crisis. And divestment is an incredibly powerful tool. And it's not just, it's not the only tool we need to take on the climate crisis, but it's a really strategic one, especially for students to get involved with. Like Noah said, when else do you have access to hundreds of millions or billions of dollars when we work together through our institutions? So it's not the only tactic. We need to keep still playing defense and fighting pipelines and other forms of fossil fuel infrastructure, every well, every pipeline. But we also need to go on the offense and taking on the fossil fuel industry directly by damaging their brand. And we know that governments have failed time and time again to actually take action on climate change at a federal level here in the United States, and then most recently at the UN climate talks in Warsaw, Poland, that nothing was accomplished. So fossil fuel divestment is an incredible way to build a movement strong enough to break the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry on our democracy. And it's a way to show solidarity with communities that are being impacted by fossil fuel companies if they were willing to stop searching for new oil and new carbon and to stop lobbying to block climate legislation, and to keep 80% of their reserves underground. That's probably not likely that BP, that Exxon will do that. So that's where the power of the national movement comes in. Right now we have over 300 campuses across the country that are calling for fossil fuel divestment. And the movement has really taken off and exploded in the last year. Helped kick off last year with the Do the Math tour, which was a 21-city tour across the country where tens of thousands of people turned out to learn about the math of climate change and what they can do to take action. And then since last fall, we've seen hundreds of campuses start campaigns. Students have gathered thousands of petition signatures at their campuses. Nearly 50 schools have passed new government resolutions calling for divestment. Many of these were unanimous or nearly unanimous. Students have met with administrators, presented to their boards of trustees, engaged alumni to withhold donations, gained national media attention, the New York Times, Bloomberg, and have organized powerful action. And that's all in 1 year, and we're just getting started. In that year, we've also seen 7 colleges commit to divest from fossil fuels, and dozens of religious institutions, cities, and other institutions. And in the last few months, we've also had more studies come out, making the case for divestment even stronger, showing that that divestment poses negligible risk to endowments with the Imperial Group study, as well as a recent study that came out last month from Oxford, talking about the power of divestment. So to counter the fact that this is just symbolic and we won't really have any impact. But it said that the fossil fuel divestment is happening now through our funding and our endowment. We can challenge what's possible over time and have incredible impact. And like I mentioned, there's actions kicking off today through next week at campuses across the country that have gotten initial rejections or no's from their presidents or their boards to divest. So schools like Harvard, Cornell, Middlebury, Boston College, the City University of New York, Brown, and Swarthmore are all taking action this week to say that this fight is too urgent to give up on. And then students have crafted a national letter together to say that we will do what it takes to encourage our schools to divest, because our future depends on it. And I also just wanted to highlight that this really is an opportunity for Vassar College to be a leader in the national movement. Vassar has been getting attention in the New York Times and other outlets around the fact that it has chosen not to divest. But Vassar could have an incredible opportunity to be a real leader in sustainability and to invest in the things we want to support, sustainable, socially responsible companies, and to invest in a sustainable future that protects you all as well. So right now, the Vassar administration has a choice to either be on the side of justice or on the side of the fossil fuel industry. So it's up to you all. Let's help them make the right decision.
So our next speaker is Professor of Sociology Eileen Leonard, who will be speaking about corporations and why divestment is a social justice issue. And speakers, by the way, I forgot to mention, you can use the podium.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for coming late and misunderstood the time for the meeting today. But yeah, I was asked to talk about the whole issue of environmental degradation as a social justice issue, and then also to talk a little bit about the power of corporations. And I just want to mention that the concept of environmental justice has been with us now for about 3 decades. The environmental movement has really broadened to include issues of public health and worker safety and community empowerment, and all of these are absolutely relevant social justice issues. So the idea that environmental protection is a right, not just a privilege for people with power, is one of the key ideas. And what's of most concern to sociologists is the influence that social factors have on environmental decision making. So factors like race, and factors like class, and factors like gender. How does that enter into what's going on in terms of our environment? And what we know is that marginalized groups are simply far less likely to have the resources in order to mobilize against environmental hazards. So there are many differences in terms of environmental quality of different locations that have directly to do, for example, with race and with racism. And this became evident, and I guess was first widely talked about in the early 1980s, when the first national study was done that revealed that race was the most powerful variable in determining where hazardous wastes are dumped in the United States. So more powerful than poverty, more powerful than land values, more powerful even than home ownership was the factor of race. And since then, it's been documented that race influences not only the siting of hazardous waste dumps, but also whether or not environmental regulations are likely to be enforced, whether or not you're likely to be exposed to environmental hazards, and also your accessibility to health care. So race has been found to be independent of class variables in the distribution of air pollution, when it comes to contaminated fish consumption, when it comes to municipal incinerators, cleanup of Superfunds, or lead poisoning in children. All of these things are directly correlated with race. And I'd just like to mention here that Native Americans have had to deal with some of the worst pollution in the United States, and they've been prime targets for waste trading and for waste trading, yes, in landfills and incinerators. And one recent example comes from the Wind River Indian Reservation. And on one section of that reservation, the people now have to boil all their drinking water because of the chemical pollutions from fracking that was mentioned earlier. In addition to having, I mean, it's more extreme even than that, in addition to having to boil all their water, fearing that chemicals in their homes might explode when they're using the water, the Environmental Protection Agency has ordered residents to run fans and otherwise ensure ventilation while they're bathing or while they're washing clothes. So this is a really extreme example. And one other thing too is that shipping hazardous wastes from richer communities to poorer communities or to Native American reservations is a clear manifestation of power arrangements and the whole larger structure of social stratification. Who's got the power, who's got the wealth, and who doesn't. And there's an important global dimension to this as well that many of you might be familiar with. With the closing of some domestic U.S. landfills because of public outrage about pollution, developing countries have routinely been approached by advanced nations to dump their toxic wastes. So advanced nations create about 40 million tons of toxic waste annually, and 60% of that is coming from the United States. But given lax environmental laws in many developing countries, what they do is simply ship those wastes to the developing countries. Now in the United States, it's estimated to cost about $2,500 to dispose of a ton of toxic waste, both legally and safely in the United States, whereas it can cost as little as $3 a ton to ship it to countries like the Philippines, or Mexico, or Central America, or African countries like Zaire or Sierra Leone. So the United States can definitely save money by shipping them to these developing nations. And it's these countries then that have to deal with the illness and the death that's caused by these poisonous substances, and they're in less of a position to do that than many developed countries are. There's also a gender dimension that I really want to mention to these environmental issues. And we know that the vulnerabilities to environmental problems are not distributed evenly among people in the world, among different races or different income groups. But the bearing on gender inequality is something that's less frequently discussed, and I think something that should be just as important to us. Women are disproportionately poor, and thus they face climate change from a starting point of acute need and limited resources. About 60% of the world's food production rests on women, which is threatened by climate change, forcing the tasks that women have in order to get fuel, for example, or to farm, for example, much, much more onerous. And climate change is also predicted to generate a rise in various types of illnesses, and that would intensify women's caregiving labor, because women are the ones that do most of the caregiving, unpaid labor in the world. So these factors put women at the center of a lot of the problems associated with climate change. But also growing research indicates another risk that women face in terms of climate change, and that's increased levels of violence against women on the part of men. Life for many women after natural disasters is punctuated by violence, and this needs to be integrated into our discussions of climate change, as well as into criminology literature, I should mention. And these vulnerabilities are certainly not shared equally by all women, but there's a complex interplay here of class, power of corporations, to see what we're up against. And I'd like to use two examples from my research in criminology that relates to environmental issues. One of them has to do with a dangerous product that affects all of us, and the other is much more related to climate change, and that has to do with BP. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the flame retardant industry. Maybe you've caught up with a little bit of this. And in May in 2012, the Chicago Tribune did a powerful investigative series on the flame retardant industry and reported that most of our furniture is full of flame retardant chemicals, and one of the most common is tris, T-R-I-S. Now, you wouldn't remember this, but you might have read about it. In 1997, there was a lot of contention that tris was found to be in children's pajamas, a lot of children's pajamas, and it was also found to be, and known to be now, the evidence is only increasing, to be carcinogenic. So U.S. manufacturers, in the wake of a lot of public protests, voluntarily took it out of children's garments, but they also did two other things. One of the things is that they shipped about 2.4 million garments that still, children's pajamas, that still had tris in it to developing countries to sell it there. And the second thing was that since they moved quickly and voluntarily took the pajamas off the market, tris wasn't banned. So from then on, companies were able to use it in other products without alerting the government or the public. So there's mounting evidence now that these flame retardants cause cancer, including neurological problems and developmental issues and impaired fertility. But the U.S. Consumer Product Commission contends that adding it to furniture exposes children to twice the daily dose of tris that's acceptable, and it actually makes the risk of cancer for children between the ages of children under the ages of 2 7 times more likely to develop cancer. Now, the problem with this is they usually spray it in the foam of furniture, but it doesn't stay in the foam since foam gets all yucky and starts turning into dust. And that's why when the dust goes to the floor, and that's why children crawling around the floor are most likely to come in contact with it. Now, the issue is often, this is also important, framed in terms of two public goods. Are we going to worry about something that's carcinogenic, or are we going to worry about being burned to death? But the greatest irony is that the flame retardants ultimately don't serve a purpose. And this has been confirmed by research through the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that once the fabric in a piece of furniture is on fire, it overwhelms any protection that flame retardants are going to give it. So both treated and untreated chairs, for example, burn at the same rate. So as one chemist said, put it, the fire just laughs at it. So we have all these chemicals in our furniture, and they're obviously not doing very good. So the public is thus exposed to dangerous chemicals and products, not for their own safety, but instead to benefit corporations. And in terms of the power of corporations, it's important to know that these chemicals, their use is being spread, because in the United States, corporations really have much more power over and against U.S. regulators. In Europe, it's required that you prove that a chemical is safe before use. In the United States, in contrast, the FDA has to prove that a chemical that's already on the market provides an unreasonable risk. Right? So this means that generations of different chemicals can be on the market before the risks are proven, and there's nothing we can do about it. Similarly, in the 1976 Toxic Substance Control Act gives the government little power to assess or limit the dangers of chemicals that are added to furniture or electronics or toys. And astonishingly, the law allows manufacturers to treat the chemicals, this is unbelievable, as trade secrets, right? So they don't have to let the government know what's in their chemicals until they're already on the market. And the EPA acknowledges that it has really little power to do anything against something like this. So that kind of environmental pollution it really needs to be fought against, and the power of corporations is really evident in terms of the way it's handled in our legal system. The story of BP gives a clear historical sense, too, of the ongoing costs and consequences of environmental violence in the United States. As you know, I'm sure, EP's environmental disaster in the Gulf, the Deepwater Horizon a leak, a spill in the Gulf of Mexico, happened in April of 2010, and it killed 11 people and immediately poured over 200 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf in the following months. And marine life and wildlife have been sickened and died, and certainly there have been tremendous economic damages done. And BP did set up a fund of $29 billion in 2010 to settle claims, and the Department of Justice settled with the company for a fine of $4.5 billion. But it's instructive to look. We'll have to wait and see how much BP actually winds up paying and how much damage actually is done, because it takes years for those things to really unfold and for us to be clear about it. But what is clear now is BP's criminal history that had been going on for years that hadn't been taken care of. In 2000, BP was convicted of dumping hazardous wastes in Alaska over a 3-year period. In 2005, an explosion at a BP refinery in Texas killed 15 workers. BP paid $2.1 billion at that point. Then in 2007, BP settled 3 different cases with investigators in the United States for a spill of over 200,000 gallons of oil in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. And a second Alaskan pipeline was leaking 1,000 gallons of oil in 2006. So what we see here is a corporation that's a repeat offender, but nothing is being done to that corporation except to fine them, and sometimes they're fines that really don't matter to a corporation the size of BP. And BP has in fact rebounded very nicely from all its lawbreaking, and including the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and making a profit of close to $24 billion in 2011. So let me move on because the time is running out here. Let me move then to strategies in terms of doing something about these problems of environmental degradation. Students and citizens certainly have a right to address these problems and to think strategically about how to approach them. And I know that divestment is a movement that's aimed at college portfolios as one of these strategies. And as you know, the current movement wants colleges and universities to rid their endowments of stocks in coal and oil and gas stocks. And this is a conscious effort to imitate the successful effort that went on in the 1980s to pressure college divestment from stocks and companies that were doing business with South Africa under apartheid. So there's really a conscious effort to imitate that. And even today, though, I'll say there are debates about how much divestment really influenced the companies that were doing business with South Africa. But what's absolutely undisputed is that it forced people to grapple with the morality of apartheid and the morality of doing business with a government like South Africa, and it profoundly affected the politics of the issue. So it really ultimately helped to force a white-only government in South Africa to the bargaining table. So it had a really critical effect. Now, universities argue now that divestment will cost them money, and I think that that's probably true in the short run. Some also argue that the endowment is not to be used for social purposes beyond educating students. I'm not in agreement with that, since it seems to make sense to me that investments should reflect your values, and the values of an institution like Vassar should be reflected in terms of what they do with their funds. And divestment could also strengthen the climate movement, and it could take aim at this corporate power. So I think that divestment is one possible strategy. I think also coalitions are something to think very seriously about when we want to do something in terms of the environmental movement, because there are clear racial dimensions, there are clear gender dimensions to these environmental problems that are going on, and it should be able to bring together groups with different interests around central concerns. Thank you.
Questions that I should I'll do that. The first question is, how transparent is the investment of our endowment? And how do we know how much is invested in fossil fuel corporations? And transparency is a word that you probably want to define each time you use it. I think in a sense, our endowment is very transparently invested because we know exactly where all our money is, and we get our return promptly every quarter, etc. But it's not transparent in terms of how much is invested in particular industries, and in particular, how much is invested in fossil fuel industries. And that's because, and this is not uncommon for colleges, the endowment is largely invested in what are called commingled funds. These are like mutual funds, they're often called hedge funds, and they're financial institutions that allow a group of investors to come together and to use the magnitude of their joint investment to make investments that aren't otherwise available to them sometimes. And the investments are managed by firms, advisors, who have claimed expertise in producing unusually good returns. And so that's the motive for using these vehicles. Nearly 85% of Vassar's endowment portfolio is in these so-called actively managed commingled funds. And the college can't specify specific investments in these cases. Off the table, both accountability in terms of how much is invested in any particular industry or company, such as fossil fuels. And that takes us totally outside of environmental issues. It takes us into investment questions. I think there's obviously a lot of differing opinions about whether the college actually succeeds in getting a higher return in this way, or whether other colleges do, or not. Okay, now I think it's certainly true that Vassar College itself has had some pretty good returns from, better than many other colleges, for example, good returns over the last several years. So then, but when one asks that question in terms of what is the evidence that this is a repeatable, reliable strategy, I'd have to say that as far as I can tell, and I've been reading academic investment studies on this, the evidence is really mixed. And there are lots of studies which show that it doesn't work. To economists, this is not a surprise. This is actually an outcome that is pretty standard. In fact, Steve Daynard, who's right up here, when he went to business school, told me that was the standard thing that he was taught. And it's still taught many places. Indeed, this year, the Nobel Prize was given to Eugene Fama, who built his career on the notion that financial markets are efficient, and that most of us can't make special returns by investing in strategic ways. Most of us includes, of course, members of this college, our administration, our trustees, and they are appealing to experts to give them these unusual returns. But nevertheless, even taking account of the, or especially taking account of the actual performance of these hedge fund experts, the evidence is by no means convincing. And lots of studies say that there are no extra returns to be had. Now, the reason economists don't find this very surprising as a group is maybe well illustrated by a joke that people like to tell about economists. I don't know if you've heard this one. There are two people walking down the street, an economist and a friend. And the friend sees a $20 bill on the sidewalk in front of him, and he goes to pick it up, and the economist says, "Don't pick that up." Well, why not? It's not there. If there were a $20 bill on the sidewalk, somebody else would have already picked it up. and that's very much a good description of how economists tend to think about many things, including the financial market. If there were money to be made, somebody else would already have made it. And that's the basic notion behind why markets are efficient. It applies to things like hedge funds and these special advisors, in that if they're so good, then they'll reap the rewards of their extra expertise. They have no particular reason to share that their wonderful skill and the rewards from it with someone else. If Vassar is investing in someone who's particularly good at this right now, then eventually someone else is going to come along and pay them more to make those investments. And if they don't pay them enough, someone else will come along after them and pay them more. And pretty soon, the body who's reaping the rewards is the one with skill, not the ones who are buying services. So that's the nature of the logic. Many people find it pretty compelling. And as I said, there's a lot of academic evidence to suggest that it's borne out, that hedge funds and lots of other special vehicles, when you look across the industry, just don't make it. Now, Vassar has done well recently. It's in the 75th percentile of a set of peer institutional colleges. But again, the question is, well, why is it there? Why is it the 25th percentile college at the 75th percentile spot? Does Vassar have some special and particularly unique expertise? Do we have people who are only helping us and are not helping others? It's pretty mysterious. Nevertheless, there's differences of opinion. Our investors, those who are responsible for choosing the advisors and giving money to these advisors, believe that it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, time will tell. The question of whether to divest still leaves us with the question of how expensive will it be to do that. I think Eileen's correct. In the short run, it could be a very expensive thing. And if you have had a chance to look at what 350.org is proposing for divestment, it isn't a sudden and costly transition out of fossil fuels, but one that accepts that it takes a while to unwind financial commitments, and that colleges should do that, take the time to do that carefully and wisely. If they did, the kind of research I was citing to you before suggests that the costs won't be great. It's not even clear that there will be costs. So then we're left with the question of why divest if it's not expensive. And I say it that way because the question becomes for me, if it doesn't cost much to do it, then what kind of credibility does that action have? If you can do something for free, if you can make a statement that doesn't cost you anything, then why should we take it very seriously? If you, on the other hand, are paying a price for the position you're taking, if it's costly to make the statement, then that deserves some credibility, because you're willing to, in some sense, pay for the position you're taking. You value it enough to pay for it. Let me talk about that just briefly, because it's important to me. Several speakers have said today, and I think this bears strong repetition, is that those who call for divestment need to be divesting personally too. It needs to cost you. And to point to the college and say, that money, which is not yours, that money over there should be divested, is cheap talk. And I think it's fair when those who criticize people who are calling for divestment say, well, what are you doing personally? Aren't there some other things that you could be doing that would be even more effective? Those kinds of arguments. We all need to step up, individually as well as a community, to the question of climate change and our participation in it. The conversation between the college and the divestment campaign has included questions from the administrative side about, so why aren't you campaigning for carbon tax? Why aren't you working for cap and trade? Why aren't you doing other things? Well, first of all, none of those are mutually exclusive with this. Secondly, there has been lots of work to try to institute carbon taxes and cap and trade. And the force of the fossil fuel industry's own campaign has been to leave Washington basically incapable of putting lots of those things in place. It's not that these things aren't being pursued. Our own president has complained of this problem in a speech to the nation about the state of our environment and things that we should be trying to do. And he has called for all of us to stand up and to make our voices heard, to counter the effects of the corporate campaign to prevent change in the way that we pay for gasoline and in the way that fossil fuels are taken out of the ground and ultimately burned. It's interesting. In the New York Times, we see for the first time, that I've seen for the first time, an article that says that fossil fuels companies are actually starting to prepare for a carbon tax. They actually see that as an inevitable thing, even though we've had such a hard time getting it put in place. And that's because I think those who think about this know that it's got to happen. We have to pay more, because we're not lessening our consumption of these fuels much. When you're an economist, you always know that there are two sides to a market. There's the supply and the demand. Divestment has tended to focus on supply, but don't forget about demand. And that's our side, right? We need to take our own stand on these things too. And I just think that's a very important thing for us to remember every time we think about asking for the college to divest. Now, why do I nevertheless think we should divest? For the reasons that have been stated, many reasons that have been stated here. Because I don't, and I want the community to agree. I don't want this to be something that we do for a minority. I want the Vassar community to say this is what it wants. And so I stand up to say that I want it so that the rest of the community can also perhaps say that. And we can agree. I hope. I don't think it's appropriate to be participating in an industry that may not be directly burning the fuels. You and I are burning the fuels. But that is campaigning to make that easy. As Eileen, I think, eloquently illustrated with some of her examples, corporations are not just producers of the thing that they make. They are citizens in a sense too. Their actions impact us, and in many cases, the fossil fuel industry has participated in a way that is antisocial, that is destructive, that is preventing us from moving forward in healthy and needful ways. I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor. Before I introduce the last speaker, I'd like to mention that if you have to leave early, it would be great if you could sign the petition that we have over here. You can also, if you haven't already grabbed a zine or a sticker, feel free to do so. So, finally, we have Professor Ismail Rashid, who can offer a historian's perspective on divestment.
Thank you very much. I got the email for this meeting about 2 days ago from what? Ben?
Yes.
Yeah, from what Ben said was that my invitation to this meeting came up because I guess I was one of 2 faculties who made it to the trustees meeting that Christina Wood spoke. My intervention came because Christina Wood evoked the anti-apartheid struggle and mentioned that Mandela, I think, supported the divestment campaign in 1986, and I disagree with her. Well, this is quite a moment to be holding a discussion like this because yesterday Nelson Mandela passed. I want to say a couple of things. Nelson Mandela's passing means a lot to the world and to a lot of people personally. It also means a lot to me personally because I was like you 30 years ago at a university, and one of the things that transformed my life was Keda Asmal, who was a South African, was lecturing in Dublin, a member of the ANC, came to a United Nations meeting that was called Mobilizing Public Opinion Against Apartheid in South Africa. I had a long and convoluted name, but we showed up as students and we listened to these people who just told their story straight from their heart about what was going on in South Africa. And suddenly South Africa did not seem like a place 5,000 miles away from where I was staying. South Africa came home in a profoundly visceral, profoundly immediate way. There was a way in which I connected with South Africa, and I realized that the struggle about that was going on in South Africa was not simply dismantling of the heinous system, post-Second World War system, that in 1980s you thought that, gosh, I thought the Nazis were defeated in 1945, what are the Nazis doing in any part of the world in 1985 holding power. But the people in South Africa who believed that black people were inferior, who made that particular argument, who got people all over the world, including the United States, including leading politicians of the United States, including Ronald Reagan, to agree that South Africa's situation was better than the rest of Africa, that you could constructively engage South Africa, and if you could only talk to these guys very nicely, they might get to a point where slowly you realize that the fellow citizens were entitled to the same rights and the same dignity with them. I start with that because that has passed, and there's a lot of people listening to the commentary on Mandela's life yesterday. You wonder, in terms of some of the wonderful and beautiful things that were being said by Nelson Mandela, he said, I wonder how many of those people 30 years ago felt very differently about Mandela's life. So yesterday Mandela was an incredible human being. Mandela was somebody who defended principle. Mandela was a person who came out of prison. But I remember in 1985, as a young student in Sierra Leone, in a country under one-party government, campaigning to free Mandela and being detained, and people asking me, what has South Africa got to do with you anyway? And it was very difficult to penetrate through that particular veil to see there is a bigger struggle here in which my dignity is connected to the dignity of people in South Africa. So I start with, and as I said, in a way this is an auspicious discussion. I start with by wanting to foreground a number of things, and then I'll make a few comments, and we can have a discussion. First is I'm not an economist. I mean, my colleague Paul Ruud is more of an economist. So he has done, and he has told you eloquently about the finance and the economics of this. I don't pretend to know the economics or the financing of divestment, and I'm not going to talk about that. A couple of things that I wanted to make, and I made this discussion in which Christian the trustee spoke, and I want to reiterate this because these things are very important. First, to underline that so we don't get Nelson Mandela wrong. When Nelson Mandela came out of prison, he reiterated that the sanctions should stay on South Africa. And the argument about what the eventual effects of sanctions were on the dismantling of apartheid, that argument is still raging. It is not an economic argument. It is not an economic argument. It is a political argument because what the divestment campaign in South Africa did to companies like Barclays, to Shell, to the various companies that invested in South Africa was it made the moral, ethical, and political cost of doing business in South Africa unacceptable. By mid-1980s, even if those companies were profiting, even if those companies were using second, third, or fourth party investment, it made the political and moral cost of being seen to be visibly doing business with South Africa very high. Part of, and I also, well, another aspect of this, is that the United States could have won the war in Vietnam. It could have decided that the price of winning in Vietnam is to nuke Vietnam. But would the United States have lived with the cost of nuking Vietnam? The British won the Mau Mau, the struggle against the Mau Mau in Kenya. It lost the political and moral cost of winning that particular victory because the cost of winning against the Mau Mau was politically and ethically unacceptable. And this is where, in a way, I sort of want to talk about what the students are engaged in. I have a sense that this is like what we're doing as young people in the mid-1980s. With young people, it's about fighting for or imagining a world that was different from the world that I lived in. 1980s, I was dissatisfied with the world I was living in. Apartheid showed that this is a world of oppression in which the social and political inequities were such that I could not imagine that this kind of world, if it continued, was the future in which I wanted to live in. And this movement is being built around 30 years from now, what kind of world would you guys want to live in? What would be your future? So this is I joke with that. This is our present. So look, 50s and above, this is our present. This is the world in which maybe 30 or 40 years ago we walked. So 30, 40 years from now, you guys have to think about the world that you want to live in. So in a sense, the divestment movement is not a short-term fight. If you guys can imagine it as a short-term fight, I'm going to pack and leave. Because is this some sexy, white, middle-class thing that you guys are doing? Or is this something that's much more profound and sort of deeper? If it's some sexy, white, middle-class, then you guys should probably here because you wanted to diversify this part. I'm going to move on because this is not the world that I want my kids to live in. I want my kids to live in a world that's different, that's more socially just, that's more socially equal than the world that you guys are living in. I don't want my kids who are black to live in a world in which they will be worried about racism, they will be worried about social inequality. I want that world to be better. And indeed the world could be better. We are moved. This is no longer the 1950s, this is no longer the 1960s. We are moved. So is your generation going to move the bar of social, economic justice forward? I think this is the question that you have to of rationality. But that rationality is in constant dialectics with our social and political value. In other words, we can shape and we can organize the world that we live in. The market does not have to organize the world that we live in. We can shape, we can organize based on our values the world that we have to live in. The market does not have to do that for us. So, some of the big questions that are being asked are questions that I don't have immediate response to in terms of the edging of bets that colleges make with regard to financial portfolio. I can't answer that questions. Our job is to get you guys to ask those questions and to consider those questions very seriously. The choices that you're making, as Paul has just said, are you willing to pay the social cost and price? We all know Nelson Mandela. I teach a course of Nelson Mandela. This is a guy, you don't want to hear the stuff that he went through in terms of trying to live a life that is in accordance of the kind of social, ethical choices that he made. This is not meant to scare you, but this is very real. I mean, this is, if it's something that you guys are deeply invested in, if this is something that you're committed with, if this is something that you want to do, morality and ethics to build, you have to think about the consequences of the choices of the world that you're living in. You might have to live less. We might have to consume less. This is a serious discussion. You might also have to consider your relationship, as we talked about, with developing countries. Because Nigeria, Indonesia, all of these countries are asking, so you guys want to stop doing stuff that you've done for 30 or 40 years or 100 years. Where the new sources or the new frontiers now of oil, coal, gas. What choices are you guys going to make usually? I'm going to stop at that particular point and we can have a conversation.
Certain position that might not be the wisest position in the long run. And sometimes they're not in the best position to see that.
Yeah, I think you can see like an interesting parallel between the fossil fuel corporations and the attitude of Vassar towards its endowment. It might take a lot of work to either pull out of commingled funds and manage our own investments in-house. It might take, a lot of work to divest. But ultimately, as we've seen from Professor Ruud, the costs won't be huge, but it will take effort. And I think it's the same thing. Why change? Why change if it's going to take a ton of effort to change, even if that might be profitable in the long run?
I'll just add one more thing I think that's important, because corporations are in the business of making profit, right? That's what they're supposed to do. They're trying to live by moral lights. It's not what corporations are set up for. So if you're trying to steer something in a different direction, it might not be the corporations that are going to think of doing that first. Their first concern is and always has been and will be making profit.
Yes.
This is more of a comment kind of also to answer that maybe. I think the fossil fuel industry is also made up of individuals, and it's people who have a lot of times invested a huge amount of their energy and their life into this system, and it's a system that's already in place too. So a lot of people aren't willing to give up a life that, they've put in, for some people it's like 40 years of their life into this company too, so it's kind of hard for them to suddenly change the system, like envision a change in the system, isn't it they've always done.
Yes, I guess kind of a follow-up question. What exactly do we want to invest in as opposed to fossil fuel companies, and how do we know they're going to be that much more socially conscious?
That's a good question. This is one of the things that the divestment campaign has struggled with, but I like to liken this to, the difference between not buying sugar because sugar isn't a, you know, like morally or ethically like well-sourced item versus, say, deciding to say you're a vegan. You know, there is a movement behind veganism. Like whether or not you agree with it, you can identify as veganism and add power to that, and you can do something to affect big ag. We're not looking at like our individual investments and saying like this one person is doing something bad. We're trying to fight a specific type of inequity, and there is a movement behind it. And transparency, you know, is important. Understanding that we're never going, you know, like right now, it's a very, very, pretty much impossible to have perfectly clean endowment. But there's something that we can do that would have a huge impact. So I think this is one of the answers. The other is that, you know, we won't know until we start working with the college to figure out what they're willing to reinvest. You know, I'm a student at Vassar College. I'm not going to have the same, you know, ideas as someone, and we need to get to the table with the people who are managing our endowment and actually figure it out. And the first step is saying, yes, we're willing to do this. Let's figure out how.
Is there really any corporation that's not going to be socially unjust? Socially injustice is the word. But, you know, even something, you know, well, iPhones in this room or Macs, iPads, whatever. I read once a week there's some factory worker in China that jumps off the roof because of conditions. Now, I actually own shares of Apple. They made about 700% since I invested 6 years ago. It's, I guess, socially unjust. But what country, I mean, what company isn't like that? Maybe the oil companies are worse, but they've also gained society that much more. Is there really any corporation that's going to be clean?
Way to divest perfectly is one way to interpret what you're saying. And that therefore one shouldn't bother. And you can see, when it's phrased that way, I think, that the answer is, well, we need to get on with this business. And this is a major component of that. I don't think, and there's any company out there that doesn't consume fossil fuels as part of its production process. The logic then that we should be investing in all those companies too, in other words, from the entire world, is a reductio ad absurdum, right? But not one that addresses the larger question of are we going to object and make efforts to halt a process that is going to burn up this planet.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question, and that opens up conversations with possibilities for coalition building between different activist groups that are working for social justice on campus, thinking about labor rights, etc. So I think actually it's a really good question thinking about what else is possible. So not just screening out negative investments of fossil fuels, things we don't want to be invested in, but then more broadly thinking about how can we use the endowment for social good and invest proactively in socially responsible ways. So I think divestment is sort of like the minimum, but universities can do and are doing more. Hampshire College has a portfolio that is invested in socially responsible ways proactively, for example. And there are resources available for universities to look to about different strategies for investing in socially responsible ways. So I think that's a good first step that other universities should consider. For example, there are also fossil-free options on the market already for fossil-free funds. Green Century Capital Management is one socially responsible investment firm that has a fossil-free option. So I think as more and more universities and other institutions are calling for divestment, these products are going to become more available, which I think is a good thing as well. So it's easier for universities to divest and make ethical decisions about their investment practices. And then the other question, like why fossil fuels versus other corporations that have labor violations or other harmful business practices. I think, again, it's the question of like the fact that the fossil fuels industry's entire business model is opposed to our survival. There's no specific practices that they can stop doing that are going to keep 80% of their reserves underground. While some other companies could tweak their practices theoretically to become more socially responsible, but I think that's up for discussion and thinking about how to proactively invest in companies that aren't destroying the livelihoods of workers or communities.
A couple of issues in response to your question. So first, as we said, I'm clearly from your contribution. The work is being done, and the work is going to be continue to be done in terms of marshalling necessary information so that we understand the science of climate change is there. The work is ongoing. So part of the work is marshalling that knowledge, which is important for people to make decisions, institutions as well as us as people. The other point, which is also sort of a crucial point, that's connected to the marshalling of information. This is also campaign that needs not only to be one based on activism and organization. It also has to be one based on the power of ideas and information. So I mean, university is the quintessential place to do that. This is why you guys are here to marshal the kind of ideas and to marshal the kinds of arguments, to engage in the argument against not only the administration, but I think on a much more larger national scale of why the divestment campaign is important. The third point that I wanted to make, and this is the introduction, is Professor Rashid is here to give you a historical perspective. But my historical perspective is corporations have not always existed and not always been the way in which they are being denied. Corporations have changed over time, they've evolved over time, and they still have the ability to evolve and change over time. Part of, I guess, what this campaign is partly trying to do is to change the way corporations act. And that is in our power to do that. The point is going to force people who are within these corporations are also made of people. They are not independent. The people who make the decisions in the corporation are living, breathing entities like you and I. And I guess they will respond to, or will be forced to respond to the agreements that are being made. So part in response to your question is that corporations have a logic. Yes, they have a logic, but there are people beyond that particular logic, and those people need to engage the arguments, the campaigns, or the voices that are being raised against that behavior. We're just talking about corporations with you guys. It's one aspect. You guys have been following the news. You've been following the news. We're still trying to sort out the crash of 2008 with companies saying that we're going to pay fines, but we're not going to accept responsibility and culpability for some of the efforts that we've done. So part of this is to get corporations to respond to this call, this challenge of this company to shape their practice.